Recording. So, evening everybody. Changed up the intro music tonight, just because I felt it was appropriate. As I mentioned, my aunt is in the process of passing on, so yeah, life can feel like a bit of a landslide sometimes, and that's what it's like right now for me. And the topic that I wanted to cover tonight is kind of inspired by the experience I guess I'm having, and it's basically something that I've kind of my aunt and I had a lot in common. Was she's my mentor in that realm of things. So I wanted to, although it's not directly linked to environmental management tools and these kind of course related things, I honestly think it's like such a fundamental idea that we don't spend enough time on it, frankly. And I'm going to show you just how important I think it is as it's played out in history, the role of spirituality, faith, religion, and how it influences, how we conduct ourselves as a species. It's big time influential. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, and probably keep it under. I tried to keep it well under an hour because I've got to get back to the hospital, but that's the plan. So I didn't want to freak everybody out with the topic of tonight. Some people get freaked when you talk about this stuff, but I don't think it's something we need to freak out about. I think these are things we need to explore. Okay, so why do you think it's important to look at this connection between spirituality, spirit, or faith, or religion, however you want to describe that, metaphysics, and sustainable development? What do you think? Connects our real life to ours, for sure. Influences the way we interact with the world around us. Absolutely. It's like programming our brain. It's how we perceive the world, and then how we perceive ourselves, and then how we interact with everything, other people, nature, the physical world. So it's really important, I think. In fact, like it is core. And there's other dimensions to it as well that I think that we'll look at, not in great detail. This is a huge subject, so we can only get so far into it in an hour, and I can peel off separate parts of this. We can go into them in more depth in later sessions. So yeah, it's about how we connect, in our work as environmental professionals, if that's what we're doing. I mean, there's a certain practical aspect to that, but already I think I've shown you with some of these lectures, the one, for instance, about ethics, that even our practical, the way we go about conducting our work life is laden with ethical decisions. Okay, and this is where values and norms influence how we make those ethical decisions. So, very important thing to look at. So, what are the belief systems that are really that we should be looking at? Because when we're looking at this in a broad scope, we want to look at kind of what do a lot of people believe, and then how does that relate to sustainable development? So what are some of the belief systems you think are ones we're looking at, like say, okay, well, how does this relate to sustainable development? Because they all have different characteristics, as I'll show you. Those that place people as dominant over the environment. Yeah, well, we look at all of them. I think those ones in particular, for sure. But like the idea here is to look at systems of belief, and then how they can relate to this idea. So the fourth, the four biggies, as they say, are Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and then there's a bunch of smallerish ones. Judaism they put in the top, and in terms of a percentage basis, bulk of people are in those categories. However, there's other, they call them smaller, I don't know what they call that word is, but Taoism, Sikhism, Falun Gong, another one, Shintoism, Bahai. So there's a lot of different kind of belief systems out there, and it's quite interesting actually to look at them, because I mean, when you look at some systems, they are quite powerful and have a lot of influence both historically and then even to their day. They influence how people react to whatever in the world, whether it be a pandemic or how they vote and so forth and so on. But there's a big one. So let's start with Buddhism. So Buddhism is actually, although I'm not a Buddhist, but I've read a fair bit about it, and it's quite closely linked to nature actually. A lot of if you look at some of the core principles that are inherent in Buddhism, and they're quite closely linked in terms of their definition to sustainable development. So one is called ahisma, which means do no harm, karuna, compassion, metta, loving kindness, and then one called paticca samuppada. Now, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing them, which is roughly translated as interdependence. So all of these kind of principles or practices or doctrines of Buddhism are actually like really kind of, if we take a step back and look at what we're trying to, the ideas that we're trying to promote or cultivate when we think about sustainable development, inherently our relationship with each other as human beings, but also, one of the core things is our relationship with the natural world. And those principles really kind of, when exercised in that way, make a lot of sense. So Buddhism, it's actually like, I can see how a lot of Buddhists migrate towards environmentalism, and then also how a lot of people who identify as environmentalists really migrate towards Buddhism. I think there's a really good connection there. I'm going to put through a couple links here. I found this one website from the Yale Department of Forestry that has a summary of world religions and environmentalism. It's really awesome. So check this out, that link there. And then there's this book that I plan to get, which is the Rutledge Handbook of Religion and Ecology. And this is, I mean, Rutledge is one of the best publishers out there. So in my opinion, anyway, I would love to be published by Rutledge. And so this book, I mean, it's looks like a humdinger. Like, it looks really, really good. So that's probably one, if you're interested in this area, that'd be one you want to look at. Okay, so Buddhism, I mean, that's a pretty prominent belief system out there, and there's kind of, it's not much of a hard sell to look at how that system can be kind of linked or associated with some of the principles that we've been talking about in terms of sustainable development. So another belief system is Islam, so being a Muslim. So I'm not a Muslim, but I've worked a lot with Islamic organizations, and particularly in the context of sustainable development or the environment. And it's a tricky one. So Islam, on the surface, I have found, and it's pretty widely cited in the literature, that because of the kind of the combat, I guess you could say, or the challenges that Islam has with respect to the modern world, and how some of their principles are difficult to reconcile with the way the world is today as we know it. And that tends to cloud out some of the kind of core principles in Islam, or beliefs and actions within the Islamic community that are really actually ecological or sustainable development oriented. So there's this kind of tension between modernity and Islam, and some of the Islamic responses to environmental crisis are often overlooked. And part of that also has to do with many of the strongest Muslim countries happen to be in the Middle East, where obviously heavily dependent on oil. So therefore, you can see that there's this kind of instant pushback. Say, how does this in any way, shape, or form align with sustainable development, and also the broader definition, current modern definitions, where we look at kind of a more pluralistic approach to gender relations and so forth. So there's a lot of challenges in that department. However, I can speak from my experience working with the Saudi government, or the Prince's Foundations. When we were doing a science center in Saudi Arabia, and I was working on that in 2002 to 2004 as the content director, we did a lot of work on examining and communicating and developing exhibits and displays and educational content around the relationship between the Quran's interpretation of science, or Muslim science, and so forth, and a lot of the many developments that have been contributed from Muslim scholars, which in the Muslim scholars during the Dark Ages basically picked up the ball. There was not a lot of innovation or science or research going on in that era, and that's where Muslim scholars really kind of excelled. And so a lot of their work was inspired through reverence for nature and curiosity about nature. So many of the inventions that they are kind of recognized for, like the astrolabe, many of which are linked to astronomy, mathematics, algebra, and so forth, are inspired by this kind of look towards the creator as that which has provided what is around us. So there are, despite the fact that there are some disconnects or challenges with respect to the modern world what we live in, and then what often is interpreted as, in some cases, barbaric by some people, and in case it is in some cases. But there's, at the core of it, there has been a very kind of close introspective look at the natural world around us. And then at a practical level, when I've worked with these Muslim communities in Saudi Arabia, conservation and respect for nature has been extremely high on their priority list. And this is what we were working with. So yeah, Islam and science and sustainability, there is kind of a pretty strong connection there in its unique ways. Hinduism. So I don't know a lot about Hinduism, but one of the key things that I've researched and at least found through my review has been that one of the kind of characteristics, I guess, of Hinduism, of Bhakti and the devotional aspect of Hindu tradition, is in the service of ecological awareness and restoration. So there are some kind of practices and principles within Hinduism that are closely related to ensuring that the natural world is intact. And in fact, so there's a Hindu eco-theologian by the name of Srivatsa Goswami that has stated, quote, "Love is the key to all sustainability," end quote. So again, Hinduism, there are some close connections there as well. Judaism is another interesting example. This has not really received a lot. You don't often hear actually a lot about the Judaism and ecological sustainability. I haven't actually, but in doing some research on it, there has been some examples that I found anyway, where this, as of late, especially in the response to the Israeli and the diaspora response to the ecological crisis, has really inspired and generated many Jewish responses in the theological and scholarly community, as well as activists and educators that are devoted towards reinterpreting some of the Jewish tradition and Jewish practices, and looking at specific literary sources that are fundamental to their belief system, and reinterpreting them and looking at them from a new lens, and looking at new ecological theologies. So quite a lot of activity in that department that I wasn't aware of, actually. And then Bahai. So is anybody familiar with the Bahai belief system? Anybody heard of that before? I got quite interested this about 20 years ago when I caught wind of that. It's relatively newer compared to obviously some of the other religions, but it's it's actually very, very sustainability oriented, if you look into it. So their appreciation for nature goes quite far beyond just the utilitarian value, but they see it as a source of knowledge at the spiritual level. And one of the really interesting things about the Baha'i faith, and I think this is partially Baha'i because it's newer as opposed to some of the older traditions like Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism, is it's newer. Therefore, some of the way in which it's structured and the way that their outlook has been formulated is a little more kind of modern and better understand some of the interconnections that are out there. So from the Baha'i faith perspective, the problems of ecology and the environment can't be separated from the problems facing the world. They view these things in more of a holistic and integrated approach, both from a scientific and spiritual point. And therefore, when we talk often of the need for interdisciplinary approaches, the Baha'i faith really embraces that. So as we will get to in the next couple of examples, that has been a big problem with some belief systems, as pointed out. Indigenous belief systems, right? So traditional knowledge of various different sorts, which there are a tremendous variety of amounts. And this is a whole topic that can you spell out the religion? It sounds behind. No, it's Bahai. Here, I'm going to just put it through. There. This is Bahai. It's got a funny accent there. So look at that. It's quite interesting. Indigenous. So we've talked about traditional ecological knowledge and First Nations relationships and so forth. And this is an area that is, you know, the whole idea of many Indigenous knowledge systems is actually more about nature than anything else, really. It's based on this cosmology of humanity being a part of nature intrinsically and not separated from it. That is one of the common characteristics to many different Indigenous belief systems, and therefore it's not a stretch to get traditional knowledge or Indigenous cosmologies and to see if there's any connection with environmental sustainability, because in fact most often they are the actual epitome of that. They are the spiritual connection of humanity to nature is embodied in many Indigenous belief systems. Okay, so what is one that I have not mentioned yet? Bingo. Why did I not mention it yet, do you think? I wanted to save it for the last. Not necessarily its connection to nature all over the map. It's because it's like it's hard to unpack. There's a lot to it. Okay, and so me personally, just to kind of for positionality purposes, you know, I was raised in that environment. Like that's kind of the framework that I was kind of brought into when I was a kid, and still identify with to some degree. But I want to spend some time on it because it's important, particularly for us, at least us as in Royal Roads University, students in a university in North America, because the structures that we most commonly refer to or default to are have evolved based on a Judeo-Christian worldview. Those values have kind of been fairly intrinsic to the development of our state system and our society, and therefore also the way in which we have related to nature and do relate to nature and presume will as we go forward to some degree. So it's a tough one, and so I think it was Sarah who had earlier on had mentioned yes, Sarah. So one of the problems that we encounter when we look at the interconnection between some spiritual belief systems or religions and nature is the interpretation of the relationship between humanity and nature. So as Sarah had mentioned, this idea of human dominance over nature has been problematic for sustainable development. It's a big issue. And Christianity is one of those belief systems that has and to some degree still does, depending on how you interpret it, promotes that worldview. Okay, so I want to get into that a bit, and understand why that is, why and how that has been played out. So, because the one thing I want to make sure that we understand is that these are not static processes. These are evolutionary processes. As we've looked at in social and ecological systems, they're not static, they're dynamic. There's a dynamic relationship between ecological systems and social systems and how they co-evolve over time. So that means that there's plasticity there. They can change, both of them. Ecosystems can change, and they do change, as does society and social norms. So this is a quote that I pulled off a website. This is from an American website, and it's quite telling. It's interesting, and then we'll get into it. It says, "Dear God, some ideas like sustainability seem to come from a different world than the world of faith. I know that everything is connected and everything matters to you, but the words we use sometimes divide our lives into God things and other things. Help me to hear your desires underneath all the different types of jargon that people use, and help me stay committed to your desires as I go about my daily work. Let me recognize the long timetable of love, loving not only you and my immediate neighbor, but the neighbors I will never see because they are too far away from me in space or in time. I praise you for being a God beyond space and time." Okay, so that's interesting because that was a quote that was on this website that I was kind of looking around. That was a comment that had been put forth and I guess highlighted to put the top of the list. But why I wanted to use it and as the discussion point is because it shows you, and this is modern, this is recent, how that kind of framework and how people position themselves who identify as Christians in this the dynamics of sustainability and what it means, because it's loaded. There's a lot of political implications, a lot of practical implications, a lot of economic issues. Okay, so I'm gonna just highlight then for the remaining time that we have and document how this is actually played out in history in terms of ecology, okay? Because how we understand and represent ecology is really influences how we craft policy that will affect it. So this whole idea of conservation of natural resources, it's not a new thing. It's been around for a while, in fact, back to antiquity. But things such as water resource planning, food sustainability, socioeconomic development are things that have kind of challenged societies for a very long time. And it's the worldviews of the societies that are faced with those issues that often influence how we then look at nature as a collective, as a society. So if we look at the history of Western ecological thought, we can pull up some pretty interesting ideas about this kind of relationship between spirituality and ecology, or nature and sustainable development, and then ultimately then how development has been planned as a result. It's a really important piece of this whole kind of challenge that we were confronted with of sustainable development. So I like to call this the arc of history of ecological thought. In modern history, I'm not going too far back, okay? What we know of ecology today, really, and in the Western world, as a science or as a system of thought, you can trace back to the 1700s. So that's when really ecology as we know it in North America as a system of thought and discipline really started to develop. So it was in the UK primarily actually when this was happening in the 18th century, 1700s. They know this, they recognize this as the age of reason in ecological thought. And they do that for a specific reason. I'm going to get into it. So there were two roads that were prevalent in ecology starting to prevail. One was one that was actually more inspired by faith, spirituality, Christianity even, that was, and they attribute it, they call it the romantic view of nature. And it was born in Selborne, a place called Selborne in the UK, by a certain individual that was kind of one of the main writers, I guess. And the other angle that was developing at this point in time was this reason approach or objective view of nature. So much like, as Sarah mentioned, this kind of separation of humanity from nature and our capability to objectively analyze nature. So this Natural History of Selborne was a book, actually, that was written, which articulates this first worldview. So Gilbert White was the author. He was an ecologist, and it was published in 1789. And so Gilbert White was quite a spiritual guy, but also a naturalist, like one of the earlier naturalists to document things. And to many, this piece of literature is considered inspirational from a kind of an eco-spiritual standpoint, and also from an ecological standpoint. So what he did was, this guy, in great level of detail, documented his small town of Selborne, everything, minute details, and put it into kind of this spiritual framework, this kind of awe in which he looked and understand how all these things work together. And he did it to the point at which that it's actually a spiritual destination for a lot of people today, Selborne, for a lot of ecologists and environmentalists. So he was a naturalist at heart, but his book, this book that I mentioned, laid the foundation for what we know as the natural history essay in America and the UK. So the whole idea of the natural history essay. And some of you have perhaps read Henry David Thoreau. Has anybody read Henry David Thoreau before? Walden would be a book that would be probably his most famous one, or John Muir even. So these are people that wrote about nature and did it in this format of a natural, the natural history type of essay format. Even Darwin, to some degree, could be put in this category. So he studied in depth his parish of Selborne and documented the minute details. He had a wide-ranging interest, but was very specifically interested in his own place. And so we've talked about sense of place, not so much in environmental management tools, but in sustainable development. And this is going to kind of come into the environmental management tools world. So he looked at the interrelationships, which he described, and these actually found the basis of what we know today as ecology. This kind of congealed. His observations of what he was seeing there was picked up by subsequent individuals, and then started to look at the connections between different things, which is really what ecology is all about as a science. So his motivation to do this, and this is why it's interesting to bring up in this discussion about spirituality, was about both his interest and an appreciation for his home and his place, but also he had a very deep respect for what is called the divine. So in his case, and in this case, the divine is a reference to the Creator. He's Christian, God. And here's a quote. His quote was, "Nature is a great economist, for she, quote, converts the recreation of one animal into the support of another." Okay? So this is also interesting from the perspective of economics, because this is also where people started to look at the economy of nature, or how resources are used and optimized, right? So the idea of the economy of nature, how nature works, was starting to be put together and articulated in a system of thought, both from kind of inspired from a spiritual perspective, but also from a practical standpoint. And I'm going to show you how this then started to amplify a bit more. He identified that there's unique roles that different species had in ecosystems. So worms being food source for a food source for lower species and trophic structures, but they also aerated the soil for farmers. So this is a guy, you can imagine, if you want to use your imagination, this guy who was probably looked upon endearingly by his other members of his community, but also with a bit of curiosity, because at this point in time, people weren't wandering around looking at worms and stuff like that necessarily, unless, of course, they were, had a mission to do. So he was just wandering around in awe about this and documenting it. So the modern concepts of ecology served as the basement for the development of this theory, and one of those is taxonomy. And so are you familiar with taxonomy? There's some biologists here, I think, right? So taxonomy is the classification of nature. So you look at, okay, the species and there's a genus and so forth, and how we kind of put different categorizations of the natural world together such that we can make order of things, right? All the way from a biome level down to specific differentiation at the genetic level of species. Okay, that is taxonomic organization. And his view was taxonomy was an activity that he thought would bring order to pathless wilderness disorder. So, and this is an interesting concept when you start to think of things from kind of a spiritual standpoint, because this is the root of the start of, or at least an articulation of, how science has been developed, was developed as a means of kind of organizing nature, and in some cases for utilitarian purposes. So White suggested that the study of wildlife and vegetation may be productive of the great comforts and elegances of life. So even he, although he was inspired by the romantic view of this kind of awe-inspiring creation, he also identified that the productive aspects of these ecosystems could be the source of many great comforts and elegances of life, meaning that these can be resources that can give us, housing and so forth and so on. So even at this stage, in this era of expansion and development, so this is an era of expansion and development, even a purist, so I would classify Gilbert White as a purist from an ecological standpoint, even he had somewhat of an anthropocentric lens. And utility, so how we use things, was, although all this again was inspired by the romantic vision of the creation, utilitarianism and the utility was a common theme throughout his writings. Okay. He had the uncanny ability to make room for many perspectives. Some of these are diametrically opposed, as opposed to, like, for example, creation versus utilitarianism. He was able to balance, though. He had this romantic view of the creation and the providence of nature, but he was able to balance reverence and science, utilitarianism, and this what they call Arcadian Delight. So Arcadian Romanticism is what they define this era of as from an ecological standpoint. So he had, an idea, or at least to go back and try and balance those things. And he could see the positives from each one of these perspectives, and amplify them. And I think this is probably why people migrate so much to his work, is because of his capability in his writing to bring out the awe-inspiring energy and appreciation of the creation from kind of the spiritual standpoint, yet at the same time, recognize that some of this creation can be utilitarian and provide for society. But history had a different story for ecology. History played out differently than just this delicate balance. During the late 1700s, there was social and economic forces that made the economy of man a much more pressing concern than the economy of nature. You see that there's this dichotomy of the economy of man and the economy of nature. And so throughout this era, there were wars for independence in British colonies, had an effect on the political and economic workings of the UK. There's social upheaval in France, contributed to the economic and political instability that would impact the views of ecology. And also at this time was the evolution of the factory system in the UK in the late 1700s and into the 1800s, where the idea of time, capital, and production becoming much more of a prominent force in decision-making and policy. So the rational use of capital resulted from the accumulation of wealth from years of trade with the Orient, and the New World resulted in investments in technology and production. So through trade, the UK had developed a lot of capital that they could deploy for development of technology and productive industrial capacity, which influences then, and it became the predominant mantra at that time, how we actually view nature. So capital and industrialization really impacted things. So wars, so the rational use of capital really influenced and had a long impact on development at this point in time, and technological development being one. So like in 1765, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, Edmund Cartwright the power loom, James Watt the steam engine, and basically industrialization and technology started to help to usher in a new era of the Industrial Revolution. And technology development was driven as a desire to increase productivity and wealth. So everything during this time was upscaled. Agriculture, textiles, manufacturing, technology development, landscapes were transformed. From these roughly about 6.5 million acres of English landscape were transformed into rationally planned landscapes and cultivated plots. So you can see that there was wide-scale transformation of nature. Now, I'm digressing a bit into more like economic history, but I want to dial it back to this kind of idea of spirituality, because they're intertwined with one another. And this is what I think one of my main things I want to get across, is you can't separate these things. Here's a quote from an agricultural reformer at the time. He said, "Make 2 blades of grass grow where one grew before." That was what they were trying to do. Basically, turn nature into a productive factory. So the Western world had changed, and this would also change to ecology, because when you have this mandate, you have this kind of impetus for research to be directed in that direction. However, during this rapid expansion of the economies in the 1800s, there was some pushback. So in the 1800s, there was a growing increase or desire for nature. This Arcadian Dream that I mentioned was captured in White's book, and it almost became a means of escape for many. And in fact, perhaps something like we're seeing right now. We've got massive productive capacity around the world, but we're starting to see, like with the pandemic and so forth, this kind of re-examination of our relationship with nature. So industrialism was one threat to this Arcadian Dream. And the Arcadian Dream had its root, as I had mentioned, in this divine source, the divine source of the creation, which again was heavily influenced by a spiritual perspective. And another threat to this Arcadian Dream, or spirituality in nature, was science, actually. So the natural history essay started at this point in time, and it started to kind of develop this, it provoked a discourse around the relationship between development and science. And so various different schools of thought emerged around how we relate to nature from a developmental standpoint, and also fundamentally from a spiritual standpoint. And these were articulated in various natural history essays. So some of the big questions that were developed were priorities. So what are the priorities for development? Questions such as rational thinking versus divine thinking, questions versus reason versus romanticism. So these are the questions that emerge in our modern day interpretation of sustainable development. And so the things that we are confronted with today when we ask these questions are about things such as the relevance of science. So does science allow us to assume a position over dominance of nature? And also, what kind of science should we be using to understand the natural systems that we have around us? The role of justice. So the role of justice and rights of nature, for instance, the rights of various groups have more of a direct reliance on natural systems like Indigenous peoples and First Nations in Canada and elsewhere in the world. Balancing of these different imperatives, social, ecological, and economic imperatives, and trying to decide along what development paths that we want to take, a pipeline or not a pipeline, and how we go about doing assessments. So for those in environmental management tools, what are the belief systems and what are the systems of knowledge that we use in order to make these decisions? Natural science or social science, which is more relevant today. So if we dial this back then to the whole fundamental question of what is the role of spirituality, religion, and belief in this whole frame, in this one short kind of snippet of history that I've shown you, I think you can see just how fundamentally important it is. Because you can see that at the birth of ecology in the UK in the 1700s, it came from a source of divinity. You know, the birth of ecology in the UK and then subsequently as a science was from a source of spiritual inspiration. Yet at the same time, that has then evolved into an ecology as a discipline and environmental science in general as a means of, you know, development, and as even Gilbert White had said, means of establishing ways in which we can create kind of the abundances and luxuries that we derive from ultimately from ecosystem services. But at the core of it really is that that spiritual value system, whatever it is that we use, and the questions that we have today about how we go forward, whether we're working in a corporate context or a governmental context or a non-governmental context, I would argue are heavily influenced by those fundamental values that are and often just based on some sort of religious system. So what I'd like to leave you today with is just the message that if you're ever working on these problems, you will be working with people, cultures, and societies. Now, in my case, a lot of the work that I do with my team is in different cultures and different parts of the world. And one of the first things I always do when I start to engage with a group, like in the Caribbean, for instance, right now, is have a good understanding of what their belief system are. Like, what is the belief system that is predominant there? Now, in the Caribbean, it's Christianity. Christianity is very, very influential in many Caribbean countries just because of the way they were colonized by the British, in some cases the French, and even the Dutch. But Christianity plays a big role. So that influences then everything, actually, how people conduct themselves, how we organize meetings actually sometimes, and then how policy gets formed. And in the case of the Caribbean countries that I deal with, in fact, this kind of, because there is that spiritual and religious framework and foundation in place, it is motivation for those people to take on environmental conservation and stewardship as a core value. It's actually a very easy sell. That nature doesn't take a second spot in those countries. So, and then correspondingly in other countries, I'm starting to see, I'm doing some work with the Saudis again now. Again, they're having this kind of re-examination of how they deal with sustainability. We're defining sustainability with them right now on a project for food security in Dammam. And religion has a big part of it. It's so important. It's the core. It is the start of the discussion. So ignoring that and thinking that it is not an issue or there's no connection there, I think is tremendously foolish. It's fundamental. And so going forward, I would suggest that if you happen to be a work project in any community around the world, even in Canada, try and understand what are the belief systems of the people and the stakeholders that you're dealing with. And religion and spirituality will be, I would think, a big part of that usually. And you can then try and then better understand how they make their decisions and how they're trying to view things. Like this quote that I pulled from this website, this person is trying to come to grips with this modern term of sustainability. You know, it is not articulated in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, and so forth, not in direct terms. It is in indirect terms. So this is a new challenge we're faced with. And part of the job of an environmental professional is to understand what stakeholder perspectives are and try and relate to that, and therefore understand what their worldview and their spiritual foundation is. Okay, so there's a lot of common ground there, and I would suggest trying to find out where those linkages are in any given community and belief system. All right, any questions? What do you think? Yeah, it's tough with my aunt. I'm going to go to the hospital right now after. It's life, though. That's the thing. She's 87 years old. She's lived a good life. She's in a lot of pain right now, and it's hard to see her in the amount of pain. So it's time for her to go. No problem. For those in 660, send questions for the tutorial tomorrow. We will still do it, but send questions in advance. All right. Well, thank you for coming out. Will we be talking about the last assignment? For 660? Sure. Let's do it. Let's make that the mission. That is what we will do for the last tomorrow, just to make sure. All right. Often not. There's more to talk about. I'm going to write some stuff on this, so stay tuned. It's something I'm working on, more on the Indigenous side of things, actually. Cosmologies and worldviews and stuff like that. I find it really interesting and underserved, you know. The Christian and the Islam, those are really underserved. I think we're doing a lot of good work with First Nations cosmologies now. That I think we're making some progress on. But I mean, no, I mean, what I see from the Christian community is very poorly developed. You know, there hasn't been a lot of talk about that. And I think considering just the prevalence of that, like how many people believe in that framework out there in the world, we need to work on that, right? I'm not going to, you know, going to realign that system with something that's a little more focused on equality between nature and humanity. I would think that's kind of at least my perspective. Scientology, anything related to environmental science? Good question. Actually, I didn't mention Scientology. It kind of gets. Has anybody read Dianetics from L. Ron Hubbard? He's the inventor of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard. He's written a book, Dianetics, which outlines that. I don't know, actually. I can't answer that for sure. I'll look into it, though. I started on Dianetics a long time ago when I was in Guatemala, like 20 years ago. I was just sitting around, started reading it. Got turned me off though. Like some of it just was a bit much. But I presume it's a modern thing that was thinking about that throughout this session. Dianetics, you're thinking about Scientology, Erica? Yeah, it's a little contribution. It's been a good time in this part of the course. Thanks, Julio. Yeah, Scientology. Well, actually, it's interesting. Like, there's the Scientology itself is quite interesting. It's worth looking at. Like, I would say, you know, spend the time to look at now the organization and how they operate. I think is a bit weird from what I understand. I mean, you know, I don't know a lot of Scientologists, but I know of a lot of rather creepy stuff that's happened within their kind of framework. A little secretive. I don't know. I just think when you're that lacked. When you lack that much transparency, it seems a bit weird. I don't know. People are transparent. There's some things to hide, and there's bad stories out there, and just the structure, the economics of it. I always want to look at the economics of a situation, right? Even the church, see how the economics work. The role of the state, like part of what I'm working on right now, is looking at the relationship between the church, historical development of natural resource use in British Columbia, and relationship with First Nations. If you want to see a bad story, read about that. Like, not a good story. That does not it's not a good look for Christianity, what has happened in BC. I'll be blunt. Okay, it's caused me to go, not good. So anyway, yeah, lots to discuss, you know, and I might choose to dive into a few of these things in more detail in future lectures, because I mean, you can only get so far in one of these. But yeah, there's a lot to go into. It's interesting stuff. All right, I'm gonna stop recording.